Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello and good afternoon. I'm Patty James of the Commonwealth Club Health and Medicine Member-Led Forum. It's my pleasure to extend a special welcome to any new club members here for this digital program this morning. The Commonwealth Club continues to be an all-digital program, although there are plans for in-person programs in the future. I encourage our viewers to become members of the Commonwealth Club. To learn more about membership and its benefits, please visit the club at commonwealthclub.org. To support the club right now with a tax-deductible gift, please click on the blue donate button on your screen. One quick note before I introduce today's guest: if you have a question, please post it in the YouTube chat area. Those questions will be forwarded to me and we'll get to as many as possible. Some of them might be appropriate to ask during the program and some at the end. And also just a small note that if you see me looking to the one side or the other, I'm just reading questions. I don't want to be disrespectful and not look at you, but I have to look at the questions. So all that said, it is now my pleasure to introduce Sam Apple. Sam is on the faculty of the MA in Science Writing and MA in Writing programs at Johns Hopkins. Prior to his arrival at Johns Hopkins, Sam taught creative writing and journalism at the University of Pennsylvania for 10 years. He holds an MA in English and creative writing from the University of Michigan and an MFA in creative nonfiction from Columbia University. He has published short stories, personal essays, satires, journalistic features on a wide range of topics. In recent years, he has primarily written about science and health, and his work has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, Wired, the Los Angeles Times, the Financial Times Magazine, and MIT Technology Review, among other publications. And of course, he is the author of the book Ravenous, which you see the title on your screen, and you're able to order. And that's what we're talking about today. So welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me on.
Of course, it's wonderful to have you. I loved your book. I mean, it reads, as I've said on social media, it reads like a novel, so I was glued to it, but it's all true. I don't know. I'm sure you'll talk as we go through about your impetus, how you came up with the idea about writing this book and connecting all these dots. But anyway, so it is about the Nobel laureate, the biochemist Otto Warburg, who was a Jewish homosexual living openly with his male partner in Nazi Germany. Yet Hitler protected him. So in the hope that he could cure cancer. So this, again, reads like fiction, but it's true. So there are many parts to discuss, but I'd like to start with Otto Warburg's youth, his family dynamic, his early life. Let's start there. Tell us about his family.
Sure. So Otto Warburg's father, Emil Warburg, was a very prominent physicist. He was Jewish. He was a part of the famous Warburg family that is best known as a financial family, the Warburg Bank. So Otto Warburg and his father Emil are cousins of these other Warburgs. And at the time, it was unusual for somebody of Jewish descent to rise to a high academic position. So his father really, rises really all the way to the top of the physics world. And Otto grows up in this house that is full of the world's greatest physicists, some of the greatest scientists in history. Max Planck was a regular. Einstein was very close with Emil Warburg, Emil Fischer, one of the great chemists. So many of these world famous personalities who would go on, if they hadn't, already to win Nobel Prizes. And, Otto Warburg intends to be, a world-changing scientist, just like the people he grows up with. It's his natural surroundings. It's what he feels is expected of him. And, the question in his mind is really not, is he going to make a world-changing discovery, but in what field it's going to be. And he does feel a sense of competitiveness with his father. And I think wants to outdo him, but which is not easy to do. His father, Einstein loved his father, Emil Warburg. And, Emil Warburg helped actually show that some of Einstein's theories were correct. He provided the experimental evidence. So Otto Warburg decides that, he's going to outdo his father and make his name as a great scientist. He's going to do it not in the realm of physics, but in the realm of biology in the living world. But throughout his life, he continues to approach biology from the lens of a physicist. He's always interested in energy and how cells use energy. So that's really the background. He had, somebody described it as almost like a prophet with a religious devotion. That's how he felt about science. He said he pitied anybody who didn't become a scientist. He couldn't imagine it. So that's the world he grows up in. And, as we'll talk about more, sure enough, he does make his world-changing discovery.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, a little pressure from the family there, or not. I have a feeling he just was who he was since he was a little kid. It was just ingrained in him to be this scientist, like you said. So before we move on to his work and his lab and all these other things, I want to talk a little bit about Hitler, because it's a main part of the book, how these two very different people tied together. So in order to understand that relationship, you need to understand Hitler's childhood. And I learned a lot about Hitler that I didn't know, the kind of child he was, but mostly about his mother. So let's now talk about Hitler's youth, tying it into his mom.
Sure. When I started to write this book, I really didn't plan to write a lot about Hitler's life, but the more research I did, the more clear it became that, almost from the time they were little, Warburg and Hitler were sort of on a collision course that, sure enough, they do collide in the 1940s, as we'll talk about. But both stories are very much wrapped around cancer. And the reason, in large part, is that, cancer had been a relatively rare disease in the early 19th century. And then Warburg and Hitler are both born in the 1880s. And by then, cancer is becoming more and more common. And over the next decades, becomes a really preoccupation of the German people. Full-fledged cancer panic emerges. So this is the environment they both grew up in. And Hitler is, sort of a disgruntled teenager, and his father dies when he's 13, if I recall correctly. And, he wants to be an artist, but, is kind of a, hapless figure. Nobody really likes him. And, the only connection he has really in the world is his mother. It's, the historians say it's really the only human being he was capable of loving. And, right at the time when Hitler's trying and failing to become an artist, his mother is diagnosed with breast cancer. And, he's absolutely shaken. His one sort of friend at the time, says that, he's never seen somebody look so depressed. And, one of the extraordinary things, it's actually a Jewish doctor, an Austrian Jewish doctor who is, carrying, I said Germany before, but I'm including Austria in that, but an Austrian Jewish doctor who is caring for Hitler's mother, and Hitler is actually very grateful and seems to have a good relationship with this doctor. And they try everything, but his mother's dying of breast cancer, and nothing really can be done. And Hitler's just forlorn and devastated. The doctor also left a testimony saying he'd never seen like another human being look so depressed. And so his mother dies of breast cancer, and cancer remains throughout, to the very end of his life, a central focus. He's an extreme hypochondriac, afraid of many diseases, but none more so than cancer. The stories, there's just one after another. At one point, Hitler stops everything he's doing and just writes out a will, because he's sure he's going to die of cancer. And he had these horrible stomach cramps and, all sorts of conditions, which he always assumed were cancer. And, part of the chilling aspect of it is he says multiple different times that one of the reasons he's in such a hurry to do all the horrible things he wants to do is because he's going to die soon of cancer, and he's got to take care of business before he dies. So the stories are really bizarre. He even had an obsession with shellfish, which some historians, this is somewhat speculative, but some historians think even that, the word in German is Krebs for crab, and it's the word for cancer. Some people thought even that was a part of it.
Yeah. Well, and evidently his mother died a long, painful, horrific death that he witnessed. So, and that will you talked about, wasn't that written? Didn't he stop everything? Meaning he was about to launch some big battle, and he stopped to do this. Wasn't it during wartime?
Oh, well, I think the will itself was at a different period, but I can talk about that as well. I know what you're referring to. There was this remarkable period in the 1940s, which, should I can talk about that now, or that comes a little later in the progression of events?
Well, yeah. Well, what do you think? Is it more family where you're going to go with this, or does it happen?
Yeah, well, I'll get to. I think that comes up a little bit later.
Okay, we'll do that a little bit later then. Okay, so now we understand, a little bit more where where their early lives, what are driving these two people,
Right.
What is their focus, what is their passion, if you will, overused word, but in this particular case, I think it's appropriate. So. So let's talk about his lab. Tell us about his lab, and and not only this amazing lab that he designed. I mean, that was quite frankly really interesting too. But then how he behaved in that lab. So walk us through the lab.
Sure.
What it was.
Yeah. So, by the 1920s, Warburg has a reputation as a brilliant cell physiologist and biochemist. And in 1931, the Rockefeller Foundation actually says, we're going to build you sort of the lab of your dreams. So Warburg personally designs the institute. He wants it to look like a country manor. And it's kind of an extraordinary thing. You have to remember, this is after, not too long after World War I, and you have an American foundation building an institute for a German. And he assembles a small, he doesn't really want academics working for him. He prefers these technicians who are brilliantly skilled, but, don't have their own academic interests. And he has visiting scientists, but he has these team of expert technicians who just do whatever he says. And he runs it, he'd been in World War I, and he runs it, basically like a military operation. They have these meetings where he just commands them what to do, and no one says anything. And then they go back to the lab. And it's incredible because, it's a relatively small operation, but they're, changing the world of biochemistry, one phenomenal discovery after another. And this continues, even into the 1930s after the Nazis come to power, and he's under incredible pressure.
Yeah, and surrounded in this lab, he was a man who liked the finer things in life, the art and the furniture and the horses. But let's digress just a minute, because you just brought up World War I. And to me, that part of his Otto Warburg's life almost didn't fit. How I was surprised at his service in World War I. Tell us about that a little bit.
Sure. So, he was a German patriot, and, like many German patriots, he believes, in 1914 that it was a just cause for Germany. And he also was of Jewish descent, and though not really out, was a homosexual, which, he was about as out as you could be at the time. He lived openly with his partner. But I think, particularly if you look at German Jews, they were in 1914, very patriotic and very anxious to prove that they were full-fledged Germans and committed to the fatherland, and they signed up for the war effort by the tens of thousands. And Warburg also loved horses and signs up for a cavalry unit, which really was sort of an aristocratic unit. And he was really drawn to it in a lot of ways. And he wasn't. I don't think he was a particularly great soldier. There are some stories about him, but I think he served admirably, and he got an Iron Cross.
He was on the front lines, right?
Yeah. Certainly for part of the war on the Eastern Front.
Yeah.
But, one of the remarkable parts of the story is that, by 1917, 1918, anybody who's really paying attention, certainly by 1918, sees that, it's a disaster for Germany. The deaths are mounting, and his parents are desperate to get him out of the German army. And it's, they're sending letters, they're talking to like the Ministry of the Interior saying, we need him to come home and do research for German food production, so on. But Warburg stays in the army until Albert Einstein, of all people, writes him a letter and says, you're too important for science. We need you to come home. And it was Warburg's parents that asked Einstein to write the letter, but Warburg does come home after Einstein asks him to. It's interesting. Einstein says, you're too important for science. And that really, Warburg was very arrogant. And, I think that's, Einstein understood how to convince Warburg by playing to his arrogance. So sure enough, he comes home, and, it's possible that, if he doesn't come home, he dies in the war, and, his incredible cancer discovery has never happened. So I like to think that Einstein really, in theory, could have played a very important role in this story.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the lab now that we did our World War I, which again was very interesting. So talk about, was it sea urchins? What was it? It was a sea creature that he worked with.
Sea urchins.
Sea urchins. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and then explain his work. So Otto Warburg's in his lab. What was his goal? What was he searching for? Almost single-mindedly.
Sure. So his sea urchin research actually, starts even before he has his own lab, when he's still in training as a medical student and, physiologist. But he's studying, he goes with all these famous European scientists to a special marine station in Naples, and he's studying sea urchin eggs. And, a lot of famous scientists at the time are, using sea urchin eggs as an experimental tool and trying to understand chromosomes and, the very foundation of modern genetics in a lot of ways go back to that. But Warburg was there with all these famous scientists at the same time, but he was, I mentioned before, he was the son of a physicist. He's always focused on energy. He wants to understand how a sea urchin egg grows. To grow, you need energy. And so he devises these really innovative, he comes up with these really innovative devices to sort of measure how much oxygen is being used, and, how much carbon dioxide is given off, and so on. And he finds that these sea urchin eggs are taking up a lot of oxygen as they grow. And that sort of makes, intuitive sense. If you're growing, you need energy. And so that's always in his mind, is, trying to understand how a cell manages to grow, because, he, from the very beginning, he wants to understand cancer. And if you want to understand cancer, you have to understand cell growth. So, the really interesting thing is that when he starts to really turn his full attention to cancer in 1923, he has these sea urchin experiments in the back of his mind. He thinks, okay, the sea urchin egg is using more oxygen, it's growing. The cancer cell is going to do the same thing. And his really surprising seminal discovery in 1923 is, no, the cancer cell is not, in fact, taking up more oxygen. It's actually doing something very strange and surprising. It's fermenting. It's taking up a lot of glucose, but instead of burning it with oxygen, as you would expect, it's actually just breaking it down, turning it into lactic acid, and spitting it out of the cell. It's the same fermentation process that microorganisms do. It gives us beer and wine and cheese and yogurt. So very strange that cancer cells were doing this. And, really a big part of cancer science for many years is trying to understand why and what sets it off. And this, continues to this day as we talk about more.
Yeah. Yes. Well, and that we could take some time talking about that. As far as what he discovered, but there was a couple real aha moments. That was one of them. Now, in his scientific community, when he started talking about this, what was the reaction from his fellow scientists when he started talking about what he was working on and his discovery?
Sure. So in the early years, I think in the very early years, it was such a new, surprising discovery that cancers behave like yeast growing on grains. It took a while to set in, but in time, people really did start to accept that this is true. They did the experiments themselves, and every cancer they tested, it seemed to be true. They tested it. Originally, they were looking at cancers, in the laboratory or in rats, and eventually they see the same effect in human cancers. And so people accept that this is experimentally valid, that cancer cells eat in a very unusual way, take up a lot of glucose and perform fermentation, just like microorganisms. But what is not accepted and what remains controversial is why they're doing this. Warburg is sure that, if a cell is not using oxygen, something must be broken. Why would you not use oxygen? He had an extremely aristocratic worldview, and he brought this to the cancer cell or to any cell. He said, oxygen is sort of what a cell is supposed to do. That's the proper way. And fermentation is something of lower organisms. And, if a cell does this, then it must be somehow broken in some way. And that debate really continues to this day as well. As, is there a problem with respiration, breathing with oxygen, or are cancer cells doing this for another reason? So that debate continues. But in time, just the fact that cancer cells were doing this was widely accepted and considered a very important discovery. And it, of course, leads to all these questions. If cancer cells are taking up all this glucose, all this blood sugar, is it possible to block it with some kind of therapy? Is it possible to starve a cancer cell? So this is really all extremely important science that's being discussed. And then, maybe we'll talk about later, after the war, it just sort of disappears, which is another strange part of this story, and then is rediscovered.
So he is he's making a name for himself with this lab, and he gets the attention funded by the Rockefeller Institute, and then he gets Hitler's attention. Again, a Jewish man. We're in a war now. Jewish people are, a lot of his scientists leave. Walk us through the beginning of the war and how and Warburg's absolute. I mean, you got to hand it to the man. He was sure nobody was going to touch him. He was just too important. And his basic persona is part of this. He was harassed. So tell us about that.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, in a way, that's the most extraordinary part of his story. That 1933 comes around, and Warburg has won the Nobel Prize in 1931. He's really at the top of the scientific world. Germany is the leading sort of scientific nation, and he's at the top of German science. He has everything he could want. His beautiful institute, as we've talked about. He lives with his partner in a beautiful home a block away. And then, Hitler comes to power, and then suddenly, everything is in jeopardy. And many of his colleagues leave right away, and Warburg thinks about it. He has the opportunity certainly to leave in the early 1933, 34. But he decides to stay. And there's, many different reasons. Part of it is that he believes that the Nazi phenomena is going to be short-lived. His cousin Max Warburg said, "You just give Hitler enough rope to hang himself, and it'll be over in 6 months," and so on. So a lot of people believe this. And Warburg, he says, "I was here before Hitler. No one's going to chase me out of here." And the amazing thing is that he is harassed again and again in the early 30s. These brown shirts come to his institute, and why aren't you sending your researchers to our Nazi marches and stuff? Why aren't you using the Hitler salute? He refused to do it. Why don't you have the Nazi flag up like other institutes? And he's livid. He chases them out. He screams, and it's amazing that he gets away with it.
Yeah.
And he almost doesn't. But they tolerated him ultimately because he was such an important scientist. And in the early years, he had all this Rockefeller backing, and in the early 30s, Germany, to some extent, still cared about its international reputation. So he had some advantages over other scientists. He was only half Jewish. His father was Jewish. His mother wasn't. So after 1935, there were special rules according to whether or not you had one Jewish parent or two Jewish parents. So there was a lot going on, but really nobody should have been more vulnerable. He has not only, Jewish father, but, living with his male partner, he had the Nazis could have gotten rid of him at any time. And they put up with him, and, they harass him, but they don't chase him out of his institute. And meanwhile, all his colleagues, by the late 30s are gone. And it's too late for him to leave. Things are sort of closing in on him. And it really comes to a head in an extraordinary way in 1941, where finally, he's literally like the only person of Jewish descent in this Kaiser Wilhelm Society who's left now. And he's running, he's got all these Aryans working for him, and he's running it like a dictatorship. And it's just too much for many of the people that disliked him. And a lot of people disliked him even before the Nazis because of his personality. So he had a lot of enemies, and they finally succeed in evicting him in 1941. And it looks like the beginning of the end for him. Germany no longer cares about its international reputation. And he's called to Nazi headquarters, this Reich Chancellery that Hitler has built, this really imposing building. And they call him in, and it looks like, who knows what's going to happen. And he sits down with Victor Brack, who is, one of the worst Nazis. He's the guy who designed the euthanasia program, who, just also worked on, later would help sort of map out the Nazi killing machinery. So, just one of the worst Nazis. He sits down with Warburg, and he tells him that we're going to let you live as long as you agree to focus on cancer. And, it's an extraordinary moment. What makes it even more extraordinary is, one is that you find out that I discovered in Himmler's sort of daily planner that he has met on that same day to talk about Warburg with Victor Brack. And that would be interesting in any event. But the day turns out to be June 21st, 1941. This is one of the most important days in all of in the entire sort of Nazi project. Only hours later, at dawn the next morning, they launch Operation Barbarossa, which is, at the time, the biggest military operation in history. The German tanks will hours later be rolling into Soviet territory, risking the entire Nazi project. And meanwhile, on that day, June 21st, just before it happens, they're all busy dealing with Warburg, talking about Warburg's cancer science. And sure enough, and if you look at Goebbels' diary, late that night, he and Hitler are staying up, and they're talking about how they're going to announce to the German people that they've just invaded the Soviet Union. And in the middle of this, it says in Goebbels' diary that they stop and talk about cancer science. So it just gives you a sense of how strange the Nazi worldview is, that even at this critical moment, they're focused on Warburg and cancer science. And, it makes no sense. I try to explain it in the book, and, we can talk about how that could be, but, it's truly bizarre.
Yeah. I thought so too. So that was actually fascinating. Almost hard to put somewhere in your head. But anyway, that's what happened. Okay, so and now let's continue on. When did I might be getting my timelines wrong, he left the lab and he moved to the US for a while and drove this poor scientist absolutely crazy, who was a very kind soul, but was, just didn't know what to do with Warburg. Tell us when that move happened and why it happened, and then what happened after that.
Oh, sure. So, after this event that I just told you about,
Mhm.
Warburg is told if he focuses on cancer, he'll be protected. So he makes it to the end of the war. And amazingly, not only does he survive, but in 1942, bombs start to fall near. 1943, I guess. Bombs start to fall near his institute, and he's actually moved to a new institute, which is, sort of a refurbished mansion, a sea house on a famous estate in the German countryside. And, this is at a time, by the late 40s when nobody's allowed to use gasoline for anything but the war effort. They're not allowed to use building materials. They pause what they're doing to build a new institute for Warburg. And, he carries out, he gets in trouble again and almost, is almost arrested again. But in the end, he survives and, has this extraordinary treatment. So, and then the Soviets, come to power and sort of take over part of Germany, and the Americans take over the other part. And Warburg is sort of caught in between, these two worlds, and doesn't have his institute. The Americans take over his institute after the war and turn it into a military headquarters. So he has nowhere to go and no lab. And for Warburg not to have a lab is, it's like Babe Ruth not having a baseball bat or baseball thing. It's like it's his entire existence. And so he's trying to find something to do, a place to go. And he ends up managing in the late 40s to get a 6-month appointment in the University of Illinois with Robert Emerson, a famous photosynthesis researcher. And it was hard for him to find a place, in part because, when he stayed in Nazi Germany, people thought, well, he must be a Nazi. He must have worked with them. And, in fact, he despised the Nazis and hated them. But, it didn't look good that he had stayed the whole time. So he gets this appointment for 6 months, and he comes to the University of Illinois. And he brings his partner, Jacob Heiss. One of my favorite details from the book is that Heiss is put into a frat house to stay, and Warburg comes and sees the frat house and is just horrified. And, he's like the most aristocratic, arrogant human being who's ever lived. From his 19th century German mansion, I just imagine the look of his face walking through the frat house. But he gets involved in this huge debate about photosynthesis. Throughout his life, he's always feuding with other scientists about cancer and photosynthesis in particular. And then he proceeds to drive everybody in the laboratory crazy, not just with his disputes, but he says it's too warm. He's used to working in these cold German buildings, so he refuses to let him put on the heat in the winter. And, everybody is walking around in their winter coats. And, he's never happy with the equipment or with who his given, assistant is. At one point, he literally is driving Emerson crazy. Emerson starts just taking a bus in circles around the town because he doesn't know what to do with himself. And, Emerson was like a saint who, it's like one of the nicest human beings who ever lived, from everything I've read about him. And Warburg really pushes him to the brink. It's a book about cancer and Nazis. There are not many funny parts in the book, but
that was a nice story. Yeah.
That chapter is sort of the comic relief, if you can put up with Warburg's antics. Meanwhile, he's alienating more and more people, and he's making more and more extreme statements about cancer, saying not only is this thing he discovered, the fermentation, important, but it's the only thing that matters. He appears in 1950 before a group of Nobel laureates, and he says everything else is garbage. All you need to know is that cancer cells eat differently than other cells. They can't use oxygen, so they ferment. And, he literally uses the word garbage for everything else. And he insists that, if if only the cancer world would just pay attention to him, we could solve this disease. And, it is incredibly important what he's saying, but the tides of science are already sort of changing. And, the 1950s, we have the discovery of the structure of DNA. There's all these interesting discoveries about cancer and viruses that are taking place in the 60s. And then in the 1970s, we have this real breakthrough where cancer, modern molecular biology is born, and they start to see that particular mutated genes can cause cancer. And by this point, all the Warburg stuff starts to fade away. He dies in 1970, and the stuff that he studied, how cells use energy, that was considered old world science. That was considered basic biochemistry. Sure, these metabolic enzymes are part of what a cell does, but they don't really matter to cancer. Cancer is a sophisticated disease of genes, and it's not basic biochemistry, so it just gets lost. It's just amazing how quickly it happens. Partially, because people don't like Warburg, but more so, I think, just because the new science seems so much more sophisticated. And it's by the 1980s, some people haven't heard of Warburg, and you have these famous papers and textbooks coming out that don't mention him. And even as late as 2006, you have this seminal textbook that Robert Weinberg puts out that doesn't mention Warburg at all. You have even the wonderful book, The Emperor of All Maladies, doesn't even mention Warburg. The famous paper, The Hallmarks of Cancer, which talks about sort of the 6 basic functions of cancer, comes out in 2000, and it doesn't even mention this shift to fermentation, which really is fundamental to cancer. So it's amazing how it got lost. And a lot of what I write about in the last part of my book is how it was rediscovered and why it's so important.
Yeah, and that's what I would like to talk about now. So, just for our members and those who are listening to this, I always like to give people sort of something to take home. So the story in your book is what makes it so interesting, but you tied together a lot of science and great information that people can learn from. So talk about how it shifted and why we're talking about it again. So I'm sure you'll have to talk about, fructose and glucose and back to metabolism, insulin resistance. So all those things from Warburg, and then it got lost. And then now, why again now?
Sure. So, the story really picks up again. Warburg is lost. And then in the late 1990s, these molecular biologists, they're focused on cancer in the modern sense of looking at mutated genes and how these signals go out from one protein to the next, which cause a cell to replicate. That's part of fundamental to what cancer is replication. And so they're tracing these genetic pathways, and they find that they lead them back to these, they seem to be causing these metabolic enzymes to change and to, sort of rev up their activity. And, it seems like, why are these old world enzymes a part of the story? It seemed peculiar to them because that was, they literally call them housekeeping enzymes. Like, sure, a cell needs energy, but that's an afterthought. The energy just comes in when it needs it. But sure enough, these cancer networks seem to be bringing them back to these fundamental metabolic enzymes. So a few sort of a few scientists, rather than ignoring it and thinking of, this is just irrelevant, a strange mistaken finding, they grow curious. Why is metabolism being connected to all this? And they start to look for the connections between these cancer genes and how cells, take up nutrients. And, it really is remarkable over the next, at first everybody's skeptical of it, but over the next decade and 15 years, they start to see that these cancer, these signaling networks are actually fundamentally linked to metabolism. And it seems that, the most fundamental role of many of these networks is actually controlling metabolism, getting the nutrients into the cell. And it's when the nutrients come into the cell that the proliferation process occurs, the sort of the causal arrow, the direction that people thought the cancer cell, well, I'll step back and say that they thought that metabolism was an afterthought, where in fact, it seems like metabolism is driving the process. And it's kind of remarkable, because if you think if a cell starts to divide and it doesn't have a way to take up nutrients, and then nutrients aren't sort of integrated into this process, it's going to collapse. One cancer scientist referred to it as a catastrophe for the cell. Whereas if you think about it from the perspective of a single-celled organism, I said before that the cancer cell acts a lot like a single-cell organism that just comes into nutrients and grows. The nutrients are a fundamental growth signal in themselves. That's what, if you put yeast onto bread or grains, it grows because it has the nutrients. It makes as many copies of itself as it can. If it doesn't have the nutrients, it doesn't go into that proliferation mode. So scientists really started to see that there's a fundamental link between metabolism and nutrient uptake and growth and proliferation. And they started to rediscover that, what Warburg had found, which is that a cell shifts to this growth mode. He thought it was because a cell couldn't use oxygen. But another hypothesis is that a cell shifts to this growth mode, not because it has to, because it can't use oxygen, but because these metabolic enzymes are getting turned on and causing it to overeat glucose. And this overeating is shifting it into this growth mode. So it's a really fundamentally different way to think about cancer. It really hit home for me when I saw this famous cancer scientist, Craig Thompson, who's now the president and CEO of Memorial Sloan Kettering. He did a talk where he just puts up a piece of bread and he shows mold growing over a piece of bread. And he says, okay, this is everybody's first cancer experiment. Everybody's done this. This is what cancer does. So that's sort of the rediscovery. And then the question that I was interested in is, okay, so cancer cells are getting more glucose than they should, and they're proliferating. Well, how does that, you always want to go one step. How does that happen? And what does it have to do with our diets?
Right.
For some cancer scientists, they're not interested in a diet. They're just interested in, okay, this is what's happening. Let's create a drug that can somehow block this. And that is extremely important. And there are some amazing new drugs that have come out of this return to Warburg. But, I was interested in naturally of, well, the cancer cell is overeating. Does that in any way affect does our eating in any way affect that?
Yep.
And, what's really interesting to me is that it really all comes together in the late 1990s, because at the same time that these cancer scientists are rediscovering that a cancer cell overeats glucose, and that's fundamental to cancer. I mean, so fundamental that if you do a PET scan, it literally just shows you where where in the body cells are overeating glucose, and that's where the cancer is. But at the same time, other scientists, epidemiologists that study cancer in populations, they're finding that obesity is profoundly linked to cancer. 13 different cancers have now been linked to obesity, and strongly linked. Others less strongly. I think it's probably just the tip of the iceberg. And so this is the fundamental question in my mind. Can you connect these two stories? Is there something about this obesity cancer connection, which, obesity is now overtaking smoking as the fundamental sort of most prominent preventable cause of cancer? And then you have the Warburg story, the cancer cell overeating glucose and multiplying. Are these two stories connected? And that, in a way, was my big project, to see if there is a connection there. Because, I'm a journalist, I'm a science writer, I'm not a scientist, but what I can do, or what I can try to do, is try to, connect the dots between these different fields, because scientists from different fields aren't often talking to each other, focused on the same thing. So I think, and this is what I really discuss a lot in the last chapters of my book, I think these really are part of the same story, and that the fundamental thing that connects them is this hormone insulin. And I don't know if I should pause here, or do you want me to go?
No. This is just where I wanted to be at this point. So I want to focus on this the rest of our time together. Please do. Continue with this.
Yeah. So the real question is, if you think about a cancer, if you think about a microorganism, you put the yeast, in the grains, whatever, it just eats and eats and makes copies of itself. But when you get into a multicellular organism, it's more complicated because, our cells don't just eat whenever they encounter food. If they did, it would be anarchy. So again, this cancer scientist, Craig Thompson, says you can think about a multicellular organism as it's almost like an agreement between all the cells and, the 70 or whatever trillion cells in your body to eat only when they're told to eat. And it's kind of a remarkable thing because, all our cells have the ability to take up nutrients, but they don't. And we have this food distribution system, which is regulated by hormones. And, first and foremost, the hormone insulin, which sort of tells, which cells to take up nutrients and how to store them, how to partition the fuels in our body. So to understand cancer as, this fermentation, overeating, and glucose, you have to ask the question of, well, what makes our cells take up glucose? And first and foremost, it's this hormone insulin. So if a cell is overeating glucose, you have to ask yourself, is there too much insulin in the environment? Could that be a part of this story? Could that be driving this, what they call a Warburg effect, or the Warburg metabolism? And sure enough, there is a remarkable body of evidence which suggests that insulin is playing a huge role in human cancers. Insulin is a growth factor. It's a growth hormone that, tells cells to eat and to divide and grow. And they've known, really for decades that people with elevated insulin have higher levels of cancer. So this has been known for a long time. It also only sort of became clear in the 1990s. And a number of fascinating discoveries were made. First of all, it became increasingly clear that insulin drives obesity and that obesity is linked to cancer. But insulin also activates all these signaling networks that I talked about before that are changing the way a cell eats. These are what scientists use the word downstream. They're downstream of insulin. Insulin activates them in the same way that a mutation would, that it sort of causes them to rev up and keep going and keep taking up nutrients. Now, insulin is a natural hormone. We all need it. But, when you have insulin resistance, this condition where insulin is elevated all the time, then you're going to have 24 hours a day, far more insulin signaling than you ever would. And it's going to be activating these cancer pathways. And once a mutation arises in it's called the PI3K-AKT pathway, you can just think of it as a growth pathway that responds to insulin. Once a mutation arises, then it's even more sensitive to insulin. And, little microscopic cancers that might appear all the time, instead of dying, instead of being starved by the body or just being wiped out by the immune system, insulin keeps them alive. And you see that many different types of cancer have many, many more insulin receptors than other cells. And, it's really striking to the extent at which elevated insulin seems to play a causal role in all these obesity-linked cancers. And, it also possibly, one of the more provocative things in my book is to suggest that, cancer used to be a fairly rare disease in the early 19th century. And maybe that's because, insulin resistance was, fairly non-existent in the early 19th century. And you see, sure enough, in lockstep that cancer and diabetes and obesity growing throughout the late 19th and 20th century. So it's very clear to me that cancer is tied up into these metabolic diseases of obesity and insulin and diabetes. I don't think that's controversial. And I think insulin is really the piece of the puzzle that sort of makes all the data fit. And that, of course, there's always like one layer back. If you accept all this, and the obvious question is, well, how does our insulin regulate, how do we end up with 50 times more insulin signaling in the blood? And that, to me, that's the real question. And, all this gets a little bit controversial, but I think that, sugar, first and foremost, is, sort of the most worrisome part of the story, because sugar has been shown. When I say sugar, I don't mean glucose. I mean sucrose. I mean, the white, yeah. So it's the sweet white stuff that we add to everything. It's 1/2 glucose, 1/2 fructose. And no molecule that we know of seems to sort of cause this internal metabolic disruption, the fat storage around our internal organs, which seems to cause the insulin resistance and the elevated insulin. So to me that, there's a lot of nuance to all of this, but to me, if there's one simple takeaway that it should be that insulin seems to be carcinogenic, elevated insulin. And if you want to keep your insulin low, the first thing you would do is avoid sugar.
Yeah, and refined carbohydrates and basically ultra processed foods. I mean, hamburgers are processed food because it's just beef ground up, but I mean ultra processed food, and a chunk of which the ingredients in ultra processed foods, other than the food colorings and all that, but it's back to sugar. And our mutual friend, Dr. Robert Lustig, is on a little bit of a mission about sugar and removing it from our diets. Well, that's our food system has to have a complete rework. Wouldn't it be interesting? I guess just you mentioned the word fundamentals, and I've heard that many times over the years, but the Warburg was working on fundamentals, the fundamentals of metabolism. And then we got away from that and got to, sexier things, or more in, the dial down of the genetics and all these things, which is amazing. But now we're going back to sort of the fundamentals. And Warburg could have not guessed what is in our food system right now. Otherwise, my guess is, he might have dialed down into this a little bit. But insulin. So what is it we know sugar and ultra processed foods. So what about, and I know you touch on this a little bit, and, I'm a nutritionist, but I'm not a dogmatic with people's eating styles, other than I hope that people eat most of their meals at home and then they use real food, so no matter what their diet is. But you talk in the book, and I know another mutual friend, Gary Taubes, is very into keto, and then you talk about low carb. So basically, how with all these different eating styles, and we all have to make a decision as to what works for us. What works for you might not work for me. So, but talk about eating styles. What are we eating that we can work through somehow? Other than to remove sugar and ultra processed foods for our diet. What about the proteins and the carbs and the fats, how they tie together? I'm sure that you're going to do a little focus on carbohydrates and the type thereof. And one other thing on that mode is, the whole, and I don't mean to be pitching Rob Lustig, but his new book, is the metabolical is feed the liver, protect the liver and feed the gut. And that ties it all into this too. So start with carbohydrates and bring in protein and healthy fats if need be.
Sure. Yeah. I'll just say that, Rob Lustig is, most famous for his famous talk on sugar. And I think, deserves an enormous amount of credit for waking everybody up to the harms of too much sugar in our diet. But, so from my perspective, and I want to specify that I'm really talking about prevention. I'm not talking about cancer treatment when I talk about all this. But, from my perspective, I think the science that I've looked at, I spent 5 years working on this book, and it really points strongly in the direction of insulin resistance and elevated insulin being a causal factor in cancer. So to me, we have to think of this elevated insulin as a carcinogen, is something that causes cancer. And if it were some sort of, man-made chemical, that was in our food or in our pans or whatever, we'd be terrified. It would be banned. There'd be warnings on it. But the strange thing is it's in us. It's part of our biology. It's just our biology exaggerated. It's a growth, hormone that's just exaggerated, ramped up to levels it should never be. So think about that as a carcinogen. A carcinogen is metabolic dysregulation, and any dietary strategy of prevention, therefore, should be, lowering, avoiding that carcinogen. So how do you avoid that carcinogen? What you do is you eat a diet which, causes insulin resistance to improve, because almost all of us have had it. One study found that 88% of American adults had some signs of it. So If you want to avoid that, I just think a sensible strategy is to follow a diet which would lower insulin levels and would be healthy for many different conditions, but as an added bonus would probably make you less likely to get cancer. There are no guarantees with cancer. Some cancers are bad luck, but some are, genetically inherited. So what causes insulin to rise? Dietary fats seem to have, as little effect on insulin as possible, almost no effect. Protein causes, some insulin spike, but not like carbohydrate. Carbohydrate causes the most. If you follow, if you're metabolically healthy, you may be able to eat a fairly normal diet. And I think that the best evidence suggests that once sugar is introduced into the diet, that a lot of the metabolic problems start to happen. And once you have those metabolic problems, once you have the insulin resistance, then getting rid of sugar may not be enough. Then you may have to cut more carbs and focus more on healthy fats and protein. So I think that in terms of prevention, in terms of lowering insulin resistance, the best evidence suggests that a diet that's high in fats and proteins and low in carbohydrate is key. Some scientists and doctors point more towards protein, some towards fats, but I think that the agreement, at least in certain circles, is that the one thing you want to watch out for is too many carbohydrates. Sugar first and foremost, but if you already have insulin resistance, then probably other carbohydrates as well. I really like the notion that Michael Pollack, an important cancer doctor in Canada, said to me, it's not that people can never eat sugar, but think of it like a condiment. Think of it like salt or pepper. It's something you sprinkle on your foods, but don't eat a lot of it, and certainly don't drink it, because drinking sugar, seems to cause the worst metabolic effects of all, in terms of quickly hitting your liver and causing this liver fat storage, which is part of the insulin resistance phenomenon.
And people need to be very careful. And ideally, don't eat a whole lot of food with labels. There's no labels on broccoli or roasted chicken, or, but you have to be careful with the added sugar. But that's sugar. But just carte blanche, the word carbohydrates. There are carbohydrates in pasta. There are carbohydrates in bread, but then there are different types of carbohydrates. I mean, there are intact carbohydrates, meaning they've never been fractionalized and then put back together. Like whole grain bread is usually, it's all been taken apart and put back together. But wheat berries are whole, they're intact. So I think for people, I mean, sugar is a carbohydrate, but I think people hear carbohydrates and I'm not on a keto diet personally, but there's no root vegetables or potatoes or certain things that have some nutrients in them. So there's different carbohydrates speak out there, and everybody has a different story. But so what is your take on that? Or do you have an interest or research done from your perspective on types of carbohydrates other than avoid sugar?
Sure. It's very clear that, more refined carbohydrates, cause a more profound insulin spike and are worse for you. I mean, think about fruit. I've said all these awful things about sugar, but fruit is full of sugar and fructose. But and most scientists are comfortable with fruit in the diet because, as you talked about, the cell structure and the fiber in the fruit causes the glucose to, rise less dramatically, and you don't get the same metabolic impact. So I don't think all, carbohydrates need to be thought of as, bad. As you have to, figure out, what they call the glycemic effect, how much of a glucose and insulin hit it causes. And some people, if you're metabolically healthy and you don't have insulin resistance, there aren't many adults in that situation. But if you are, then, I don't think you have to worry that much about, I would still avoid sugar, but I think you can tolerate a lot of carbohydrates. There are many societies in human history that have eaten a lot of carbohydrates and been metabolically healthy. It's really only, I think, after the introduction of sugar, first and foremost, that you start to see a lot of these problems. And so once you have these metabolic problems, then I think you want to avoid most, certainly processed carbohydrates. But I think each individual, you can get a pretty good sense of what's working for you just, by simple blood tests, looking at, your body. Are you losing weight? So I don't think it has to be one size fits all, but I think a common sense thing is, to focus on more fat and protein and less carbohydrate, because that just keeps insulin lower. And when your insulin's lower, then, your insulin, part of what it does is it traps fat inside your fat cells. And so when your insulin's lower, the fat, Gary Taubes uses the analogy of a wallet. Fat from, the diet comes into the fat cells and it flows back out, you burn it. But if you have elevated insulin all the time, the fat is getting locked in, and it's just a natural sort of logical response is to keep insulin lower to sort of restore the metabolism of your whole body. And, I'm only talking about cancer, but there's even more evidence for insulin's role in other conditions.
Well, years ago, I did some volunteer work at a breast health center with one of the local hospitals, and the women would come in that were in treatment, and we would all recommend a very low sugar diet, because it simplistically was said, sugar is a cancer feeder. Not everybody agreed with that at the time, but I think pretty much everybody agrees with that now. So if you have, again, I know you were working primarily on prevention. So eat a healthy diet if you want to avoid any kind of metabolic disease, of course, and cancer. So healthy fats, enough omega-3 fatty acids in relationship to omega-6s, and the healthy fats, and then whatever kind of protein you eat. But the big thing is you recommend limiting the obviously sugary drinks particularly, and staying low on the carbohydrate. And if you have cancer, that's probably even more so important. So that's probably a little bit of a summary through this. And for those of you who haven't read Sam's book, we just touched on some of these details. We didn't really talk about Otto's partner all that much and what he did. Oh, the man, holy cow. Anyway, so really interesting and more dialed down into food. But, the take home is watch your sugar and know that it's everywhere. And your sugary drinks, your sodas, and the fatty liver disease. That's non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Showing up in kids. That's all sugar. So the sugar, metabolically speaking, is a nightmare. Cancer speaking, it is as well. Somebody has a question. We already talked about fiber, mitigate the glucose rise in fruit. We did talk about that. Insulin is insulin the culprit, or the elevated sugar causing insulin to rise the culprit? What about IGF-1?
The IGF-1 story, that's insulin like growth factor 1, and that's certainly, that's another hormone that's part of this story. And there's a lot of nuance to that science, but elevated insulin seems to also increase the IGF-1 signaling. So I sort of lump them together for the sake of simplicity, but I think it does. Sort of the IGF-1 issue follows the elevated insulin. So I just focus on the insulin when I talk about it. But, one of the interesting things about, when I started writing this book, I thought the whole damaging effect of sucrose, the sugar, was just by its effect on insulin resistance and elevated insulin. But there's emerging evidence that some cancers, colon cancer in particular, can actually consume the fructose directly, and that fructose actually is uniquely good at driving the Warburg effect. So the case against sugar continues to build even in the time that I was working on the book.
Yeah, well, a fascinating book, and we could talk for probably a couple more hours on this, but hopefully everybody has a reason to go purchase your book, read this incredible story, and how his work from this very difficult, brilliant man is front and center again, and what that means to us. So so basically, Sam, I want to thank you so much
No, thank
for
you.
your comments here today. It was wonderful as well. And I want to thank all of you who are listening today. So this program will be on the Commonwealth Club's website soon. Again, that's commonwealthclub.org. And now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, commemorating its 118th year of enlightened discussion, is adjourned.